Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to talk about the Prime Directive in Star Trek, which is a very big topic with a lot of contradictions in the various Star Trek shows, and so it might be a very long video. I will probably have to do multiple parts to fully cover this topic and to try to theorize and to come up with excuses and explanations to explain how it all might work, and also give my opinion on how it should work if it was all in reality, how such things should be handled. And so I will have to go into science and politics and sociological issues. Not everyone will agree on all of these topics because they're all controversial with different opinions. When should you intervene militarily in another country, or in this case another planet? And how will you colonize another planet if it has life forms? How do you classify different life forms? Is it okay to colonize a planet if it has no sentient life? How do you determine sentient life? And so that has to do with philosophical issues. And so that's why this is such a huge topic that I keep postponing making this video because of it, because I know it will take me 10 hours to cover this topic fully. So my overall opinion on the Prime Directive is that it's a very interesting and good idea in Star Trek, even though it was often self-contradictory, and in some cases I would even disagree with the very existence of it in certain situations, and so it's very convoluted with the canon and continuity of the Trek shows. And in some cases the heroes of some of the shows did completely immoral acts in the name of it. And so, namely, one episode of Enterprise did something that I find despicable and then tried to pass it off as the right thing to do, which I think was kind of stupid. And so this will be a very, very long discussion of all of those different kind of cases and how I would do it if I was making the rules, or what would I do if I was in such a situation in which the rules say something which I think personally is immoral. What would I do? Would I violate the rules or not? So this is a very big discussion which will often be controversial, and in many situations a lot of people will have different opinions, and so this will be a debate. And I'm not claiming that I know all the answers. In some cases I will tell you that I don't know what I would do in that situation. In those cases when it's 50-50, like, I guess I would say in the end what I would finally do if I was, the captain in such a situation, but it doesn't mean that it's not okay to have a different opinion. So this is maybe one of the biggest topics in all of Star Trek. So let's begin. First of all, in general, I think this idea is very good, but it also was like a double-edged sword in the show, because on the one hand, it's a very good idea, and that's something that should probably be part of the rules of how you engage aliens if they actually exist, if you actually can go to other planets and other civilizations, how you should behave. So the Prime Directive, overall, in how it was presented most of the time, I think makes a lot of sense in most situations. And the problem in the shows is that it was like a double-edged sword, because even though it makes sense overall, but how can you do a show like that? Because if you simply cannot intervene in other planets, then how can you do a story? And so very often what they would do is show that they accidentally got involved, they accidentally got people stuck into the situation and then being unable to get them out. And so in order to save their own people, they do have to intervene, and yet the intervention is often kind of a force for good. And so the message is like that you should intervene even though the rules say that you shouldn't. And in some cases they did it so that the heroes of the show will look more heroic, because they have to risk their own careers, they have to violate their own rules to do the right thing, because that's the moral thing to do. And so in some cases it was a way to enhance the heroism of the main characters, and in other cases the violation happened by accident and then they have to fix it. And in other times it was all part of some galactic struggle. If there's a war with a different big empire in the galaxy which does intervene, then will you still not intervene even though it's all part of that balance of power? And so there are so many different situations and different factors. That's why it's going to be a huge video. And so I think the idea of it is good, but the execution of it is very problematic, which kind of makes the whole idea in the first place kind of stupid retroactively, because why didn't they took any of those situations under consideration from the beginning? Why make such a dogmatic, simplistic rule for any situation when obviously it's not as simple as that? So some of it was made simply for the audience sake, so that you can't quote a whole long situational rule book. You have to make it simple for the audience. Also, it begs the question, why cannot a captain of a starship make that decision based on the situation? Why does he have to follow some very simplistic rule made up by someone in a very big distance? Not in that situation. What would he do when his own crew is under danger? In some situations they say they're supposed to sacrifice all of their lives and not to violate the Prime Directive. Other times it's apparently okay to violate it under those kinds of conditions. Obviously a lot of the captains violated it and were never punished for it, so that means it's okay to violate it in those situations. So we end up with such a convoluted mess in the end that it makes it questionable why even have those rules in the first place if they don't really follow them in the end. They do what they think is right in the end, they're not punished for it, and so what's the point of calling it a Prime Directive? Maybe you should call it the Prime Advice, because most of the time they don't follow it, and in some cases they kind of make the episode in a way to allow that intervention without it being labeled as a Prime Directive intervention, meaning that they kind of retconned it by saying that you can't intervene on primitive planets, but you can intervene on planets which are post-warp, which can contact the Federation and ask for help, then it's okay to help them. If it's a member of the Federation, obviously it makes sense that it's much more allowed to intervene because they willingly joined your government, your Federation, so now you can intervene on that planet much more freely. And so in a lot of episodes of Star Trek TNG they often said that planet is a candidate to join the Federation, but it's not fully in the Federation yet, and so the Prime Directive still exists, but it's not as strict, I guess, because they're willing to join the Federation. They basically ask for the Federation help, then that makes it more allowable to intervene on that planet because that planet kind of invited the Federation. So we have a lot of episodes in TNG which had that excuse, and there were a lot of episodes in which the crew accidentally got stuck on some planet, or some crew member is being held prisoner on a planet, and then they have to make the moral choice if they should violate the Prime Directive to save that person, even if it means meddling in the society of that planet. And usually the answer is yes and never has any consequences, so that means the Starfleet or the Federation views it as a legitimate excuse to violate it. And so if that's the case, how come they still debate it the next time such a thing happened? We have a lot of things to discuss, but let me go back to the beginning. I think the idea itself is a very clever idea, which sets some kind of rule book regarding how you behave out in space. If there are many planets with aliens, then that's a very clever way to be careful and not just go out in space and do whatever you want. So you have to respect the rights of other civilizations on other planets. You have to be careful to avoid conflicts with them. You have to be careful not to accidentally cause disasters that you might not be able to anticipate by, intervening in some delicate ecosystem that you don't know enough about, and if you intervene there you might cause some big chaos on such a planet, or politically intervening on other planets without knowing the full picture, and what right do you even have to do that, and how would you feel if someone did that to your planet? If someone comes here, some aliens come to our planet and they tell us how we should behave or not in our politics, that would be kind of ridiculous. And that's also something that is kind of brilliant about the Prime Directive, is that it explains how come we don't see any aliens showing up today, because if we live in a universe like in Star Trek in which there are so many aliens all around us, how come we don't see any of them? So the Prime Directive kind of explains that by saying that because we are a pre-warp planet, then other more advanced planets are not allowed to intervene on our planet because we are too primitive. So they are leaving us alone until we develop enough to be welcomed into the interplanetary community, if it exists. And so that would kind of make sense. And so that's something I love about the Prime Directive, the fact that it explains how come we don't really see aliens showing up all the time. Maybe there is already some kind of galactic federation which is shielding us from interference because we are so primitive. And it reminds me of a movie called Contact, which is a really good movie, which shows us what might happen if humanity discovers that there are aliens, how will humanity react, all the bad things that might happen as a result. And so that's a very good movie that shows us such a scenario, so I highly recommend that movie. And we also have a whole bunch of other science fiction shows that are not Star Trek, in which there is no Prime Directive and in which humanity is interfering on other planets. And I'm specifically thinking about Stargate SG-1, in which obviously there is no Prime Directive, and the team goes to other planets, they see some kinds of injustices, and then they try to correct them, and they free other people from their dictators and all of that. And that's kind of the anti-Star Trek in that regard, because in Star Trek they were careful not to deliberately interfere on other planets, to let those planets, those civilizations develop by themselves without the interference, because the interference might make things worse. And yet in Stargate, they didn't seem to have that limitation. They were just going around and doing whatever they wanted. But it's kind of a different situation, because in Stargate, most planets were basically inhabited by humans from Earth who were forcibly abducted from Earth and put on other planets by aliens who enslaved them. And so SG-1 goes around basically freeing those people who are humans from Earth. They free all of them from these dictators that kidnap them. And so it's not exactly the same situation. It's much more forgivable. But the best episode that kind of reminds me of why a Prime Directive would be necessary is the episode The Other Side, in which SG-1 comes to a planet which has two warring sides, and they start to help out the side that they arrive to. And so they assume that they are telling them the truth. They assume the other side is the evil one who started the war, and so they help out the side that they arrived in. And in the end of the episode, they actually find out that the side that they've been helping out is actually the evil side, and the other ones are the good guys, at least according to their morality. And so in the very end, they kind of switch sides. And so that was a very good episode that shows exactly the problem of doing that. How can you come to a planet that you don't know anything about and just randomly decide to help out one side against the other, not knowing the full details, not knowing the truth about the situation? And even if you did decide to help out the so-called good side, what right do you have to even do that? And if you don't allow the planet to sort things out for itself, then how can you know if it will learn from its own mistakes, that civilization, how will it evolve if it doesn't make the mistakes in the first place? So even if you help out the right side, you might just mess things up in the later future, because maybe they'll have another war later which will be even worse. And so you kind of have to let planets go through the natural development process. That's one of the biggest points about the Prime Directive, and especially everything that has to do with religion. That's one of the things that made most sense with the Prime Directive, because, you know, if you have an advanced civilization like Starfleet coming down to a primitive planet, obviously they'll be looked upon as gods with magic powers, and obviously those primitive people will start to worship them and all of that. And so that's one of the most obvious times when the Prime Directive is a good thing, because that protects that planet from such an influence. Because otherwise, what would stop some advanced alien from just landing on a primitive planet and enslaving the population, pretending to be God? Just like in Stargate. That's what the Gaul did. They pretended to be gods because they had advanced technology, which seemed like magic to primitive people, and then those people willingly enslaved themselves to those gods because they worshipped them and believed in them. So the Prime Directive basically protects the primitive planet from such an event, and it allows them to develop naturally without outside interference, and wait until that people becomes more scientific and enlightened, and then you can show up and tell them the truth about aliens and all of that. After they're past that point, which they're just go into religious mode and just worship you, or maybe think of you as devils, or maybe it will start a holy war on that planet between different sides. And so there's so much potential mess you can cause that it's better to be very careful around more primitive people. And the best episode that showed us what might happen was the episode Who Watches the Watchers, in which the people of a primitive planet accidentally started thinking that Starfleet are gods, especially Picard is the main god, and started to worship him, and then it was almost impossible to stop it. Picard had to basically convince them that it's all simply technology they don't yet understand, and that he's not a god, and all of that. So that was one of the best episodes that show why the Prime Directive is a good idea. And the question that was never really fully answered is, does the Federation also prevent other alien powers from interfering on primitive planets? Because maybe that's all fine and good in Federation space, but what if some other advanced alien decides to go into some other planet which is not in Federation space? Like, what if some Ferengi goes to the planet Mintaka 3 and wants to be declared a god there and to be worshipped? Will Starfleet somehow stop him or not? Are they allowed to stop him, or is that also interference? Maybe they'll only stop him using diplomatic or economic means without, enforcing it by a threat of violence. And so that's what makes all of this issue much more shady and much more problematic. Starfleet didn't interfere with the Cardassians conquering Voyager and didn't really attempt to do anything to help liberate Voyager because they said it's all happening inside the borders of the Cardassian Empire and therefore they have no right to interfere. But the initial interference was of the Cardassians on a primitive planet, which is against the Prime Directive. So why didn't they try to protect Voyager? Why didn't they enforce the Prime Directive? And so maybe they're not allowed to enforce it on other people. So if they're not allowed and they're only doing it in their own territory or in the planets that they explore, but they don't prevent others from doing that, then maybe in some situations it would be better off to interfere as well to counterbalance the other interference. If some alien shows up and declares himself a god, maybe it would be a good idea to show up and to explain to the people on those planets why those are not real gods so that they will not get enslaved. And so doesn't Starfleet have the responsibility to protect those planets in such situations? And so that's when we get into all kinds of fishy situations, which is not as simplistic. And we also had a lot of situations in which the whole civilization of a planet is about to be wiped out. And back in TOS, they actually said in those situations they are allowed to intervene to help save such a civilization, because what can possibly be worse than the whole civilization getting wiped out? Obviously, it would be better off to interfere, even if it might cause some problems and some damage. It's still better off than the whole people simply getting wiped out completely. And that makes sense in my opinion. And yet in TNG, in some episodes, they said, no, we still cannot interfere. Even if they're about to be totally wiped out, we still are not allowed to interfere in any way. And that, I think, is despicable and totally immoral and makes no sense, because what can possibly be worse than the whole people getting wiped out? So why shouldn't you at least rescue some of them if you can? And again, in some episodes, they did end up doing that, but they were kind of forced into the situation by someone. They did not intend to save those people. And so there were a lot of episodes like that which I disliked because of the very notion that they should let whole people die, even though they are fully sentient humanoids just like them, and yet they would refuse to lift a finger to help them even if it's easy to do, simply because of the Prime Directive. So in those situations, I totally disagree with the idea of it. And also there was the infamous episode of Enterprise in which they encounter a civilization which is dying from some sickness. Dr. Phlox finds a cure for it, but then in the end of the episode he tells Archer, you know, we have the cure, but we shouldn't give it to them because there's another people on the planet, and if the people who are sick get wiped out, then those other people will rise to dominance, and yet if we help out the previous people, then they will not rise to dominance, and therefore we should let all the people die so that the other group can rise. And so Archer agrees with him in the end, and so they had the cure and then just didn't give it to them. I think that was maybe the most despicable episode of Enterprise and maybe the entire franchise, because what kind of the hell of a message is that? So you have the cure, you have a way to help some people, and yet because of some political speculations you refuse to do it. And so that was such a bad episode and such a huge missed opportunity, because the whole show is a prequel. What they should have done is a prequel is to show why the Prime Directive was established later, and they have to show the mistakes that humanity made in space that made them invent the Prime Directive later. Instead, Archer simply invents it without real logical reason. He just invents it by himself and just doesn't do anything and leaves those people to die when he could have saved them, which is completely stupid. What they should have done is that he does decide to help them, and then maybe a season or two later, when they come back to revisit that planet, suddenly they see the effects of it, and then they can show that there was some kind of disaster that happened as a result of their interference, something they couldn't predict, they didn't expect. And so that would at least show why the Prime Directive was later invented, to prevent such cases. And so that's what they should have done as a prequel. They should have had episodes in which they do try to help out other planets and other people, sort of like what they did in Stargate SG-1 all the time, and then show us all the situations in which they accidentally, unintentionally mess things up. And then they can show us why the Prime Directive was later invented to prevent such cases. And that would make it interesting, and that will also make the heroes heroic, because they do try to save people, they do have good intentions, but they can go into all the intricate details of all the possible unpredicted situations that might happen. And so that will at least show us and explain to us why they have to be extra careful in the future with such topics. And so that was such a big missed opportunity, one of the biggest missed opportunities in Enterprise, that didn't fulfill its potential as a prequel, and instead did the opposite thing, which is, just deciding the Prime Directive exists even though it doesn't exist yet, and Archer decides not to help out people in distress without any real logical reason to it. and in an almost kind of racist way. Basically, he chose one race over the other. He said, you know, that other race, which is more primitive, Phlox tells me they're on the rise, and so maybe we should let the other one go extinct so that this one, what the hell, these are people, right? Why not save both of them? Why not do something to help all the people on the planet? Why not, tell the government of the people you're trying to help, we will give you the cure if you give more rights to the other group, or if you resettle them on a different continent, or find some kind of diplomatic solution for this so that both people can live. What kind of a solution was just saying, we'll allow that whole other people to simply die, they will commit genocide against all of them so that the other group will live? What the hell of a solution is that? That's probably the most immoral episode of the entire Star Trek franchise, I think, with a terrible message and makes no sense. And a total missed opportunity as a prequel. They should have done the complete opposite and then show us the results, and then we can discuss it. And since we are talking about other planets and aliens and whole alien ecosystems, I think it would justify taking an extreme cautious approach, because you don't really know until you study an alien planet for a century and know every little detail. You can't really make decisions on changing that planet, because you can't really know what it might cause. Maybe you will accidentally cause a mass extinction. And it was never really explained in Star Trek how exactly do they colonize other planets. Do they only colonize planets which had no previous life? Do they bring all the vegetation and terraform the planet in order to settle it? Or do they settle on planets which have vegetation and simply don't have sentient life forms? That seems to be the case, and yet everything looks like Earth in most planets, and so maybe it's just a limitation of the budget of the episodes, not to make everything look too alien because it's too expensive. Or was it intended to show that the planets were terraformed? Or maybe it's allowed to settle on any planet which doesn't have sentient people who own the planet, and then you can colonize it. It was never really fully explained in Star Trek, and that alone is a very fascinating topic that we can discuss for hours, because how can you determine if some animal on a planet is sentient or not? Maybe it's on the verge of sentience, but it's not yet fully sentient, and so what do you do in that case? Or what if it's some kind of very exotic alien that you simply don't know is sentient at first, and you already start colonizing a planet, and then might accidentally get into a war with some aliens? What if there's some kind of aquatic alien, like the whales or dolphins on a planet, but you don't see them at first, and so you start colonizing the planet, and then those aliens show up and say, hey, it's our planet, what are you doing here? And so I wish Star Trek would have done more situations like that, and not just humanoid aliens everywhere, which are basically exactly like humans, which is kind of simplistic idea. And so I wish Star Trek would have done more exotic stories, and once in a while they did. And most of the time the Prime Directive episodes were about politics or religion, and sometimes it was a morality tale that, some character wants asylum from his own planet because his planet is suppressing him or his group and so on. And then Starfleet has to decide what to do, because on the one hand, they're not allowed to intervene. On the other hand, the characters realize there's something immoral by their standards on that planet. And so there were a lot of good episodes with that, and often Picard kind of really towed the line on what he can or cannot do in such a situation, and tries to pick the best option without violating the rules, but also doing the moral thing. And so that's why I think Picard was a really clever character in a lot of situations which required a lot of delicacy and really careful choices, and there were a lot of interesting situations like that in which he handled them really cleverly. And it's one of the many reasons I really love Picard as a character, because he often managed to find a very creative, clever way to fix such a situation which is very delicate, by finding some kind of creative decision, which is also the legal one and also the moral one. So he would often find some kind of clever way, some loophole to fix a problem diplomatically, trying to avoid using violence, and still winning, still fixing the problem. And so that's why Picard was a very good character most of the time. And of course, in some situations they also do have to resort to using force and violence, especially in self-defense. If there's some other evil empire in the galaxy that does evil deeds, obviously sometimes you have to fight them. It's not always possible to avoid it. And it kind of begs the question, what would theoretically happen if some alien empire tries to conquer a primitive planet? Will Starfleet come to their aid and reveal themselves or not? And so in TOS they did, when there were some planets in which there was some kind of civil war, and then the Klingons would arm one side of the planet and Kirk would arm the other side to balance it out, or because it was all part of the bigger galactic power struggle. And so that was a little bit iffy, morally speaking. And in those situations, I would say you have to do what is best for the biggest amount of people. If that little planet is in some strategic position that you cannot give it up, and so maybe in those situations it would be justified, because if you don't do it, then the Klingons will conquer it, and it will be even worse even for the inhabitants of the planet compared to if Starfleet wins. And so maybe sometimes necessary evil has to be done sometimes in order for the big picture to be better for everyone. And so this is where we get into all kinds of political questions that we can debate forever, and there's an endless amount of possibilities. It's almost like a chess game that you have to pick the best possible course that will result in the best solution for the biggest amount of people. And so obviously it will be controversial. Obviously not everyone will agree on the best possible course, and there's also that attitude of absolute morality that you cannot do any necessary evil ever, no matter what. And that attitude happened especially in Star Trek Voyager. There were some episodes like that when Captain Janeway, in some episodes, she was willing to sacrifice people to achieve something, and yet in other episodes it was the other way around, that she would be willing to screw up all the rules in the book just to save one person. And so sometimes she'd be willing to sacrifice her entire crew to protect the Prime Directive, other times she's willing to screw up the whole quadrant to protect her ship. And so she kept kind of changing, so she was kind of an inconsistent character, and her morality was all over the place. And sometimes it was kind of preachy ideology, like we hold on to our ideals no matter what, even if we die because of it, it's still worth it. And so I would often disagree with all those kinds of ideas, but at least they did try to have all kinds of morality tales and morality dilemmas in a lot of episodes. So even if I disagree with the choices the characters made, at least the episode presented us with a dilemma. So that show is also a very big can of worms that I can discuss all the different strange morality choices in that show. And sometimes she's willing to trade technology to a less evolved species just to get something for the benefit of her one ship, even if it might screw up whole planets in that sector and so on. And then in later episodes she said, no, I never violated the Prime Directive, and obviously she did. And so Voyager is maybe the most messy show, morally speaking. And it's kind of a unique situation because that ship was so far away from the Federation, they cannot really contact Starfleet or the Federation to ask for instructions. They have to make decisions on their own. So maybe that justifies it a little bit, because they don't really have that option. Because in Star Trek TNG, if Picard had some kind of dilemma, he didn't know what to do, he can always contact his superiors, or in some situations the Federation Council has to give permission to do something with some planet. But in the case of Voyager, they cannot contact the Federation Council, they have to decide what's best by themselves. So maybe it kind of justifies it a little bit. Maybe that's why they were not all court-martialed in the end, even though they probably should have been. And then came Star Trek Enterprise, which was a prequel, so they didn't have a Prime Directive. So I wish they would have done more episodes in which they show the crew trying to intervene to help a planet and then messing things up, and then it would explain the Prime Directive. So I really wish they would have done that. There were a few episodes that tried to do it, and often it was not really that well done. The writing was not good enough for such a complicated topic to be tackled, and so often they just made terrible episodes with that idea. And in all the modern Star Trek shows, they kind of gave up on the whole idea of the Prime Directive completely. Like in Star Trek Discovery and Star Trek Picard, they behave as if there is no Prime Directive anymore. They can just do whatever they want. And there was even a line in one of the short treks when the new Spock said that the Prime Directive is immoral and all of that. And also in Discovery they showed that Starfleet admirals are working with Section 31, or even giving orders to Section 31, and even saying that they're involved in world building on other planets, and that it's never pretty, and so no one even raises the Prime Directive. So what the hell, why didn't Pike respond by saying, what about the Prime Directive? How can you casually mention that you're sending Section 31 to intervene on other planets when it's so obviously against your Prime Directive? So, that's one of the reasons I always say that a Section 31 show is such a terrible idea, because that's like the antithesis of a Star Trek show. And Star Trek always had that rule that you're not supposed to intervene on other planets, you're only coming to explore and to make peaceful contact, you're not there to tell other people what to do, maybe except for extreme situations in which you might help out if you have to, but that's not the reason you came there. And yet then they want to do a Section 31 show, which will be all about interfering in other people's affairs, and probably doing all kinds of shady things like false flag attacks and creating chaos in other planets to save the interests of your own planet, which is like the completely opposite idea of what Gene Roddenberry wanted with Star Trek. You know, the whole point of showing Starfleet is an enlightened force, which is not kind of a force of colonization, of going and conquering other planets, and yet Section 31 will obviously be doing the opposite, and so what the hell? And so apparently modern Star Trek simply decided to give up on that whole idea in the first place. They almost never mentioned it. There is no Prime Directive, and also in general there are so few stories of actually encountering new civilizations and making contact with them and all of that. Usually it's something little in the background, and it's not really about that anymore. It's all about action scenes and wars in space, but not really about exploring and meeting new civilizations, which is one of the biggest problems I have with the new shows. It doesn't really feel like Star Trek anymore. It's more like a Star Wars or Starship Troopers, and not really Star Trek, which is about exploring the unknown, going out into space and meeting new things and new situations. And so that's one of the problems I have with the new shows, that they almost never deal with any such issues at all anymore. They just gave up on it. They don't have imagination to do such stories. And that's one of the many reasons I always say the older Star Trek shows were much better in terms of writing, in terms of science fiction stories and morality tales, and all of that was much better in the older shows. So anyway, that's it for now. I will make more videos about this topic because, as I said, it's a very big topic which requires a lot of discussion of a lot of different situations. So it will probably be in multiple parts. So that's it for now. Let me know what you think and we can discuss it in the comment section below. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, click the notification bell to see updates of new videos. Check out all the links in the description below, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.